Can we live without Russian oil? Much of the money that Russia makes comes from the sale of oil and gas, especially to Europe. Vladimir Putin has used this money to invade Ukraine, destroy the country and kill its people. In effect, that oil was paid for with blood. Many countries have imposed sanctions on Russia to put pressure on Mr. Putin and his government. While some sanctions have been effective, none would be as effective as putting an embargo on Russian oil and gas. But is it possible to do this? Well, join me as we explore the answer to this question. Can we live without Russian oil? The world consumes just under 100 million barrels of oil per day. That's what countries consume. That's what you and I consume every day, in the form of gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, to fire up our industrial processes, to produce electricity, to heat our homes, or to make petrochemicals. Now let me put 100 million barrels in perspective. If you have ever seen one of those large oil tankers, you know the big ones. We call them VLCCs, or very large crude carriers. Each ship is about 300 meters long. Imagine the size of 3 football pitches next to each other. One of those ships can carry about 2 million barrels. So how much oil does the world consume? Imagine you pile up 50 of those ships every day, or 18,000 ships in 1 year. That's what we consume, whether we like it or not. Now, somebody has to produce those 100 million barrels every day to supply our needs. According to data from the BP Statistical Review of World Energy, the 3 largest oil producers are the United States, producing about 16 million barrels per day, Saudi Arabia producing 12 million, and Russia 10 million. Russian daily production is equivalent to about 5 of those large oil tankers. Now, countries produce, consume, import, and export oil. In the case of Russia, they produce 10 million barrels. They consume 3 million internally, which leaves about 7 million barrels per day available for exports. Before the invasion of Ukraine, about half of those exports were going to the European Union, with the other half going to other countries in Europe, then some to Asia, and a little bit to North America. Since the invasion, the United States and the UK announced they will not buy any Russian oil, although in reality they didn't buy much of it in the first place. But other European countries have not been able to do the same. Why is that? Well, because 7 million barrels per day is a lot of oil. Nobody can immediately substitute those 7 million barrels from Russia. No country has that sort of spare capacity. The Americans may be able to produce about 1 million barrels more, but not immediately. And they need to make investments that would take between 6 and 12 months before that oil gets to the market. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries could potentially increase their production by up to 2 million barrels per day, but so far they have done smaller increases. Put simply, if countries want to avoid buying Russian oil, they have 3 options: consume less, deplete their inventories, or find other sources. This explains why some governments are pouring oil from their strategic reserves, but this only works in the short term. This also explains why the US government has approached countries like Iran and Venezuela, who have been under US sanctions for many years, to see whether they can make more oil available. Iran, for example, could probably supply another 1 million barrels per day. All told, if a full embargo of Russian oil were to take place, the rest of the world could make up around 3 or 4 million barrels, which is a lot, but it's not enough. The oil from Russia could not be fully substituted, at least in the short term. Oil prices have been very volatile recently, especially since the invasion. A full embargo would mean much higher prices too. Now let's look at this from the Russian side. If the EU were to stop imports of 3 to 4 million barrels of Russian oil, these barrels will have to find new markets. China can buy more, but the logistics are more complicated, because most of the oil moving from Russia to Europe is by pipeline, and some even by rail. Russia cannot simply switch to the east because there are not enough pipelines to China. According to The Economist, quoting the consultancy Rystad Energy, Russia could reroute at most 500,000 barrels per day from Europe to China by pipeline, and another 200,000 barrels or so by rail. This is far below the lost exports to the EU. So oil would have to move to Asia by ship. But this has other problems. First, it takes a lot longer to get to Asia, about 45 days compared to 10 days to get to Europe by ship, and much faster by pipeline. Additional costs are needed. Besides, shipping companies, insurance companies, banks, they're also having to navigate under an umbrella of sanctions. In reality, Russian exports have not disappeared. What has happened is that supply chains have shifted. Sales by pipeline into Europe continue, while Russian exports by sea are selling at a discount and are finding their way to China and India, who are not participating in the sanctions. What does this all mean? The world cannot live without Russian oil, at least for now. Sadly, Mr. Putin is using this tool as economic and political pressure and keeps funding his war in Ukraine indirectly. Now, what if we reduce our consumption? Again, reducing 7 million barrels per day is a lot. This hypothetical reduction would carry enormous personal, political, and economic costs and could not happen immediately. The world is coming out of a pandemic. For comparison, demand in 2020 declined on average about 10 million barrels per day. Many governments do not want to impose additional restrictions on their citizens. Any reduction we can do individually will help, of course. And I'm only talking about oil here. The case of substituting Russian gas into Europe is even harder. It's not all bad news, though. The current situation is forcing Western governments to act more urgently on the energy transition. Reducing dependence on Russian oil, gas, and coal is now firmly on the agenda. The winter is over in the Northern Hemisphere, which means less demand for Russian gas, at least in the short term. Demand has also been shifting, even if slowly. You see, over time, the global economy has become less dependent on oil. 50 years ago, the world required almost 1 barrel of oil to produce $1,000 of economic output. Today, to produce the same $1,000 of GDP, adjusted for inflation of course, we need less than half a barrel. Here's an example to understand this point. A car today gives us twice as much distance per liter of fuel than a car 50 years ago. Another example, think of how much of the world's economy today is based on services or the internet, which requires less oil per dollar of revenue compared to other types of economic activity like heavy industry or farming. In other words, while oil demand nearly doubled in the last 50 years, the world economy quadrupled. And this trend continues. Back to Russia and Ukraine. I'm not sure Mr. Putin ever imagined that the international community would respond so strongly to his invasion of Ukraine. Even if the world is still hooked on Russian oil and gas, at least for now, it has set many countries on a path where they will want to depend less on Russia as a supplier in the future, either by getting their oil and gas from somewhere else or by moving more quickly to other sources of energy. He inadvertently accelerated the energy transition. On top of that, Mr. Putin has isolated himself and has damaged Russia's economy and reputation. Frankly, Russian people deserve better. As for Ukraine, it is difficult to see how the Russian president could keep control of the country in the long term. With this war, Ukrainian hearts and minds will shift further to the West, which is exactly what Mr. Putin was trying to avoid in the first place. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Watch this space because I'll be publishing other videos on the topic of energy. In the meantime, you can check some of my other videos, leave your comments, click like, subscribe, whatever you want. And I'll see you next time.